So I'm going to hand over to Peter now and let him go through his presentation. Okay, thanks, Peter.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Hi, everybody. I'd say it's nice to see you, but I can't actually see anybody. So, but I hope you're all having a nice time today. Sorry I couldn't be with you in person. As it happens, I've got a horrible cold at the minute anyway, so it's probably a good thing that I'm not there in the room with you. My name's Peter Etchells. I'm a professor of psychology and science communication at Bath Spa University in the UK. And science communication's my big thing, really. I'm interested in how we interact with technology, what sorts of impacts they can have on us. So I've written a couple of books on this stuff now. This is the most recent one, Unlocked. And one of the main motivations, really, I've had in writing those is to push back against what feels like this very persistent negative cycle that we find ourselves in when it comes to having meaningful discussions about the way that digital technologies impact our lives. So I'm going to today concentrate on some very broad questions around that. This book came out in March, and since then it really feels as though the conversation shifted quite a lot. There's this renewed sense of urgency that something is deeply, fundamentally wrong about modern digital tech, and that we need to do something about it right now. But I think it's really important to note that while the worries that we have about new tech, they are valid, they're also not new. And moreover, these worries are very complex. They're numerous, and while we might feel like there are simple solutions to them, these are in fact not quite as clear-cut or as evidence-based as is sometimes made out. So I want to give you an example from nearly 75 years ago that illustrates this point. So in September 1950, sci-fi author Ray Bradbury wrote this story. It's a short story called The World That the Children Made. And the story follows a family in the then not too distant future, so probably around about now, who live in a fully automated house called the Happy Life Home. For the two children, who are called Peter and Wendy, by far the most enthralling aspect of this house is the room that they call the nursery, which is it's sort of like the holodeck from Star Trek. You can go in there and it will turn it into any sort of reality that you want it to be. So they become increasingly obsessed with playing this ultra-realistic reality to the point that their parents, who are called Lydia and George, just start worrying about their whole entire way of life. And they also can't seem to understand why the room seems to be stuck on this persistent recreation of the African veldt, hence the picture here. And there are these lions in the distance that are always gorging on some sort of unidentifiable animal. So as the story progresses, they bring in a psychologist who suggests that they've made a mistake as parents, they've got this wrong, they should switch off the nursery, leave the house, and go back to a more simple way of life. This doesn't really go down well with the kids. They beg for one last go in the nursery before they leave the house, and they go in and lock themselves in. And when George and Lydia, the parents, go in to get the kids out, the kids run behind them, lock the parents in the nursery, in this recreation of the veldt, with the pride of lions. And let's just say that's the point at which the parents figure out what the lions have been eating this entire time. It was a remarkably prescient story, I think, for a number of reasons. I think it does a brilliant job of capturing some of the modern day anxieties that we have about screens and digital tech. So Peter and Wendy become obsessed with this virtual reality that the nursery offers them, so much so that they lose interest in everything else. They're painted as lazy, self-centered zombies. They're only interested in passively absorbing the world around them, rather than taking any active interest in it. And taken at face value, I think the message is really about the consequences of allowing this form of technology into our homes and how it can be disastrous for the family unit. But I think the moral actually runs deeper than that. So this story really is about the consequences of using technology as a surrogate caregiver. So at the start of the tale, George and Lydia have basically abandoned their kids to the substitute care of the house. The house literally does everything for them. So Peter and Wendy are left to their own devices to find and create their own entertainment in the nursery. And when the parents realise too late the extent to which this has maybe damaged the relationship that they have with their kids, they go for the nuclear option of getting rid of it all, rather than thinking about how do we talk about this? How do we communicate with each other about the situation that we've got ourselves into? And on top of all of this, the family's breakdown is facilitated by an inept psychologist who doesn't really seem to know what he's talking about. If all of that sounds familiar, It's because pretty much the same storyline is happening right now, just on a larger scale and with fewer parents hopefully being fed to virtual lions. So over the past decade or so, smartphones have enjoyed this massive surge in popularity, and so too has been this equally populous rise in the worries that we have about their effects on us. We've broadly couched these in the context of what we call screen time, but I'll move this more towards social media a bit later on. But basically, the amount of time that we spend on smartphones, tablets, video games, consoles, things like that, has become this catch-all term that we use to really encapsulate the fear that we've got that society is becoming more narcissistic, more unwholesome, more regressive. We worry that video games might make us horrible people. We worry that social media is not actually that social at all. We worry that kids are becoming glued to their phones. And critically, we worry that all of this is having a terminal and irreversible effect on our mental health, that we're addicted to our screens. So it's easy to understand, why we care about this stuff. If you look at data from the Pew Internet Research Center, it's about 95% of teens in the US have access to a smartphone. Nearly half of them report using the internet almost constantly, almost all the time. From the UK recently, we saw some concerning statistics around suggesting that nearly about a quarter of 5 to 7-year-olds have their own smartphone. More than a third of them use social media. Screens are a near ubiquitous part of our everyday lives now, and they're a part that's often viewed as fundamentally disconnecting as an experience. When we're on our phones or our computers or games consoles, we're locked out of reality. We're not engaging with anyone or anything, and we've all got personal experience of this, right? We've all got that feeling of we've overdone it a bit too much on our phones and scrolled through Instagram too much late at night when we really wanted to go to bed. And we can all relate to that trope of, walking down the street or being on public transport or something like that, or in a cafe. We look around us and everybody is on their phones, and it just doesn't feel right. Now, addressing those fears, and those are very real and to a certain extent justifiable fears, that's not an easy thing to do. And yeah, we can turn to scientific evidence to help us understand what the effects of screens and social media and things like that are really having on us. But the story there, as I'll try and suggest later on, it's quite a complex one. It's difficult when you have a complex area of research that shows mixed effects. It often falls flat when we hold that up against our personal lived experience. So I'm fully aware that if a scientist comes along and says, screens are not inherently harmful, that they're not inherently addictive or damaging, that's the point where I start to lose people, because that's a message that just doesn't fit with what we see around us, with what we feel is going on. So instead, when we see stories appear in the news where other scientists are sounding the alarm about screens, we listen and take note to that because it fits with our worldview. I am not here today to tell anybody that their lived experience is wrong. What I will tell you, though, is that there is a disconnect between what we read about screens in the news and what good science, so the type of science that can be truly helpful in understanding and managing our worries about screens, what that can tell us. As a science communicator, I've been interested in this sort of public debate around digital tech, not just because it's where my research interests lie, but also because I think it provides a really good example of where good science communication has gone wrong over the past few years. Now, I showed you a few headlines about screens already, but in my view, we only really started to notice a surge in concerns around about 7 years ago, and it seemed to coincide with this article. Published in The Atlantic, which was one of the most widely shared science opinion pieces that year. So in it, the author, who's called Dr. Jean Twenge, she reflected on how a new generation of kids born between around about 1995 and around about 2012 have over the past decade and a half seemed to be suffering almost from a suspension of adolescence. So they spend more time at home, less time working, dating, driving. They've been getting less sleep, feeling more alone, and perhaps most worryingly of all, they've been getting more depressed. What set that article apart from most of the scare stories that you'll see about screens in the news is that these are not idle musings. Twenge's a research psychologist in this area, and she was drawing on data from at least two massive data sets So what we call nationally running, longitudinal, long-running nationally representative surveys. These are sort of studies where you ask people, in this case teenagers, loads of questions repeatedly over time. The same questions over time, so you can track changes in that population. And what these studies showed was that over time, teenagers were generally reporting more time spent on screens, and at the same time, were reporting lower levels of various measures of mental well-being. But more than that, though, what we were seeing were statistically significant correlations and associations. When you do the stats on these things, these differences are meaningful in some way, statistically meaningful. So teenagers who report spending more time on screen-based activities were more likely to report feeling more depressed and report having at least one suicide-related outcome. And on the flip side, teenagers who reported spending more time on non-screen activities, so things like going to church or exercise or having a paid job or just meeting up with friends, they were less likely to report mental health issues. From about 2017 onwards then, what we started to see is a number of these stories appear in the news, supported by papers, scientific research papers that were being published that showed correlations. So as screen time goes up, mental health goes down. And at the same time, we start to see a lot of media reports of those sorts of articles, using the data from those studies to produce infographics to try and explain this relationship that appears to be there. And I think this is where we really started to see some problems in the public debate around screens. So here's an example of some of the data from this time. So this shows variations in the average number of symptoms of depression that teenagers report over the course of about 15 years. So we've got 2000 to 2015 on the horizontal axis here, and the average number of depressive symptoms that they report on the vertical axis. These are data for girls. And the general argument that was made here was that these data show a progressive uptick in depression symptoms. And certainly from about 2012 onwards, around about here, this looks quite drastic, right? Why might that be the case? Well, we can think about what happens at different points in time. And actually we can say that, well, you know, the iPhone, the start of the smartphone era in a way, well, that came out in 2007. And it certainly looks like, especially for this data, if you look at what's happening before this line, things are okay. You know, there's a bit of variation, but things look fairly straight. But then after this line, things seem to start getting really, really much worse. Now, the studies that cropped up on this issue around this time were all essentially correlational in nature. And what I mean by that is that you ask people, how much time do you spend on your screens? And you ask them, how do you feel? And you get two numbers out of that. And if you get lots of people doing that, you can look at, well, you know, if people who report higher levels of screen time, do they also report poorer levels of mental health or better levels of mental health? So correlations, as the old adage goes, correlations don't imply causation, but they're useful to know nevertheless. So all of these studies, the problem was all of these studies were essentially correlational in nature. And I think there's two important things to note about their lasting legacy then. So the first is that this picture that you can see here, this is such a compelling graphic to show, right? Versions of it ended up appearing everywhere and continue to do so, actually. I saw articles from the past 9 months or so where you see versions of this graph. When you're presented with a graph that shows a trend line that shows that some aspect of mental health is getting worse over time, it's really hard to ignore the fact that when you draw a straight line on that graph, things are different before and after, and therefore that thing that's denoted by the straight line has to be involved in some way, right? It's really hard. This is a really compelling thing to show people, but it's also a very simplistic thing to show people. So let's add a little bit more complexity to it. So we've got the iPhone launch in 2007, but that doesn't really explain this surge from 2012 onwards. Well, what happened then? Well, Instagram launched in 2010, but Instagram launched on Android in 2012. So let's put a line down there. That might help us. Now, a lot of articles that I've seen that use this sort of data have suggested that 2010 onwards refers to the smartphone era. So let's put a line down there. But if we're being we're all worried about social media at the minute more so than screen time generally, so that's fine. But if we're being strict about social media having an effect, well, Facebook launched in 2004, so let's put a line on that on the graph there, and that's weird because it seems to coincide with a drop in depression symptoms after that point. And we can make it more complicated by saying, we were looking for data for girls there. What about the data for boys? That's the yellow line on this graph. Well, that doesn't seem to help things either. I'm perhaps being a tad facetious here, but the issue is that these sorts of data, or rather representations of the data, have driven this very simplistic narrative that A, something universal happened at some point in the mid-2010s that has caused drastic changes in well-being indicators, and B, that thing is the phones or screens or smartphones or social media. It's one of those sorts of things. What I mean by that is that these graphs do a very good job of oversimplifying the complexities of how mental well-being works. And they've convincingly showed us that it must be the phones, because how do you deny that things were before the line were okay and things after the line were bad? So what happens then is other scientists come along and say, hang on, there's no good evidence that it's the phones. The mental health is never something that you can explain by one monolithic cause, good or bad mental health. When somebody comes along and says that, we immediately fall into the trap of going, okay, well, if it wasn't the phones in 2007 or 2012, what was it then? What happened? What else can explain this uptick at 2012? What one big societal thing can explain this? And then we get into the cyclical debate that we have done over the past 8 years or so, where people come along and suggest, well, maybe it was this thing. And then other scientists go, well, here's the evidence that it's not that thing. And we go through almost like a laundry list of things that might have impacted mental health in a big way in the 2010s, and debating for or against them, and people convincingly arguing that it's not this one particular thing, like the global financial crisis. And what we're left with at the end is, well, it must be the phones by order of elimination. Now, I'm not saying here that depression rates haven't gone up in teenagers over the past 10 years. There are, again, that's a complicated story. That's a story that would take another hour, I think, to go through, because the picture, again, is nuanced. It depends on what mental well-being indicators you're looking at and in what countries there. But the point that I wanted to make here was that although these data show a statistically significant correlation between screen time and depression, i.e. as screen time or phone use or social media goes up, depression also goes up, it's in fact a very weak correlation. And since 2017, there's been this big heated argument amongst researchers as to whether it's a correlation that actually means anything at all. Regardless of the scientific debate, though, what's going on with evidence and data, we have been bombarded with graphics of this nature, and they have the power to really scare us. And it's a story that's complicated by the fact that different studies show different things, even though they use the same data. So, for example, using an updated version of the 2017 dataset that kickstarted these concerns, in 2020, researchers at Columbia University, led by somebody called Noah Kresge, they found a different picture. So on average, daily social media use was not associated with an increase in depression symptoms in girls. And for boys, there seemed to be potentially a protective effect. So depending on your underlying risk of depression in terms of this study, there seems to be either benefits or risks from using social media depending on your sex, basically. This is something that we see consistently in the screen time literature, right? Some studies show very clear negative effects. Some studies clearly don't show negative effects, and sometimes they show positive effects. How do we do something with this, and how do we sift through a literature and make sense like this and make sense of it? And I think it helps to acknowledge a fundamental problem here, and I suspect you've already spotted it, which is that when we talk about screen time, what are we actually worrying about? What are we actually referring to? When we talk about screen time worries, it's usually in reference to social media or video games or video streaming services. But screen time is really a catch-all phrase. It's anything that we consider being online, right? So it can also include Zoom calls, online shopping, doing work, doing homework, reading ebooks. That might seem like a straw man argument, but I would apply the same criticism to the term social media as well, because we're all talking and worrying about social media at the minute. There are lots of potential legislative efforts to ban social media. There are no clear definitions of it. So even when we just talk about social media, what are we talking about? Facebook, TikTok, Twitter, Snapchat, Instagram. They all make sense. Fortnite can be classed as one. Minecraft because of the chat features. WhatsApp, YouTube comment sections. Roblox, Google Classroom, depending on the definition, all of these things. Text messaging can be included as a form of social media if you don't get your definition right. These are all very different types of software with different modes of operation. And it might seem that I'm nitpicking here, but it's actually really important. You know, if you look at what's happening in Australia at the minute, last week, legislation was put into not into force, but put into motion to ban social media for under 16-year-olds. And immediately Snapchat came out of the blocks and said the definition doesn't apply to us because we're a messaging service. So this sort of thing is important, right? It's a problem for general discussions around screen time and social media, but it's a huge problem for research in the area as well. Studies which look at screen time or social media often poorly define what it actually is they're assessing. And that goes some way to explaining why we have so many different effects in the literature. But the same is also true for mental health. That's a term that can include things like depression, anxiety, happiness, self-esteem, emotional distress, and lots of other things. But just like with screen time, in an attempt to make sense of this literature, they are all often considered the same thing, basically, and we talk about them in terms of a vague banner term of mental well-being. So psychologists call this the jingle jangle problem. And jingle jangle problems are an issue because if they aren't properly addressed, if you're not clear about and consistent about how you categorize these things you're trying to measure, it can make it very difficult to move a research field forward because everybody starts talking at cross purposes and getting very angry with each other, and that spills over into public debates, and it actually stifles our ability to do good research. So in 2019, Amy Orban and Andy Shabilsky, who were both at Oxford at the time, tried to look at the scale of this issue. How much flexibility is there in the way that we define screen time and mental health? And what does that mean for our understanding of how the two are truly linked? So they looked at some of these really big data sets. So the two US-based ones that I've sort of mentioned already, a UK-based one called the Millennium Cohort Study. So these sorts of data sets are amazing resources, right? So they run for years and years and years. They gather an immense amount of data on people, on anything and everything. And that's fantastic for all sorts of reasons. It allows you to go in and look for how various different things might have impacts on our health or our behavior. But it does mean that if you're a researcher, if you want to use that data, you need to make some difficult decisions early on about precisely what data you're going to use and what sort of statistical analyses you're going to do, what sort of analyses you're going to do at the end of it. So to highlight how much of a problem this might pose, so I call this analytical flexibility, this idea that you have to be careful about which measures you pick. As if you're interested in how does screen time affect mental health, or how does social media affect mental health, the measure that you pick that represents screen time and the measure that you pick that represents mental health, you need to think carefully about what those are. Very often in these data sets, you have lots of choices. So if you look at all of the possible outcome measures that are available here, what they tried to do in this study is do that. So look at all of them, combine them all, and analyze them in every possible way to see what happens. Is it the case that it doesn't matter how you pick your screen time measure, or is it that it really matters? Let's focus on just one data set, which is the Millennium Cohort Study. Now in this is basically a survey that runs every year, and there are 5 questions about screen time in there. So about TV use, video games, social media, owning a computer, things like that. There are 24 questions that adolescents fill out themselves about their own well-being and their own self-esteem. And then there are another 25 questions on what's called strengths and difficulties, which is again a measure of mental health and well-being, that's asked of caregivers about those teenagers. And then there are a whole load of other what we call third factors. So things that you might think will also have an impact on mental health, and you want to make sure that you're accounting for that. So maybe things like socioeconomic status is a classic one. So that means that if you want to do a research study and an analysis looking at the relationship between screen time and mental health, you need to make a decision about which combination of these measures you want to use. So you might use all of them. You might combine all 5 measures of screen time in one go, or you might use one of them or 3 of them or something like that. If you just take the Millennium Cohort Study alone and work out how many theoretically sensible ways there are of combining the screen time measures and the well-being measures, with as well as accounting for reasonable factors which we know impact mental health, you get 2.5 trillion ways in which you can ask that question. 2.5 trillion ways in which you can answer a reasonable question. You can ask a reasonable question about how screen time impacts mental health or mental well-being. Sometimes hard to get your head around what a trillion looks like in reality. If you wanted to work through all of the, if you want to do all of these analyses, let's assume that you're running 100 every second. It would take you 800 years to do all of them. Science is slow, but not that slow. So in this study, what they did instead is take a subsample. They did 20,000 reasonable combinations. So what they did is do every analysis that uses every measure that's been reported in other studies beforehand, combinations that include everything, and then a randomly selected set of combinations. Now, each time you run this analysis, you get a number, which is basically like a correlation. It represents the relationship between screen time and well-being. So after 20,000 analyses, you get a sense of the average effect that comes out of the data. Now, that average effect varies depending on which of those 3 data sets you use. But for the Millennium Cohort Study, they found that for every 1 point increase in your measure of technology use or screen time use, there was a 0.032, 0.04 point decrease in well-being. So as screen time goes up, well-being goes down. Overall, a negative association between them. But it's really, really, really small, really small. Screen time doesn't explain about 99.6% of our well-being. Other things do. Why am I talking about studies from 5 or 6 or 7 years ago? It's a good question. There are a number of reasons. One is that I think these sorts of studies really set the scene for the debate that we're having today. Not so much about screen time broadly, but about social media and smartphones. And both of those, as I've argued, they're still quite broad terms, but these studies are still very much relevant, and they were very impactful at the time and continue to do so. The second is that the paper by Amy Orban and Andy Shabilsky, I think it's very often referred to as the potato paper, because there was another analysis in there that said that, if you look at the effect of eating potatoes on mental health, it's about the same as screen time. I dislike the fact that it's referred to as that quite a lot, because for me, the point of that paper wasn't to say screen time is not something that we should worry about. The real point of that paper to me is that it shows how careful we have to be when we use these sorts of really big data sets, when we're trying to answer a very complicated question about something that we use every day of our lives. These sorts of data sets are very rich treasure troves of information. The hard part has been done for you already. Somebody's already gone and collected data from thousands and thousands of teenagers. You don't need to do that. You just need to run an analysis. But with great power comes great responsibility. If you blunder your way into the numbers without thinking about how or why you're doing it, you will find a correlation, and it will look like a strong correlation, but that may very well be a spurious correlation. So researchers who use this sort of data then, I think obviously they have a duty to do the research correctly, but I think they have a duty to communicate the results of that research in a suitably cautious way. But I think the problem is that since that paper, we by and large, we've not listened to that message. The vast majority of research that is still coming out on this topic does the same thing. It asks people, how much time have you spent on your phone? What's your well-being like? And it does a correlation. What we call a cross-sectional study, which is when you measure it, you get data at a single point in time. And I would say that we've got to the point now that these sorts of studies, I see them literally coming out every week, and I think they're a bit useless, to be honest, because if what we want to do is move the field forward, we need to go beyond correlational studies and think about smarter ways to run an experiment on this sort of topic. That's actually getting increasingly hard to do because there's now so many conflicting studies out there and such a heated and emotional debate about it all that researchers and commentators are starting to get ideologically entrenched. It's very easy to look at this in terms of viewpoint-based evidence. If you really believe that social media is bad for kids or bad for everybody, it's increasingly hard to change people's minds on that based on research evidence and based on objective data. Now, we've got some evidence here now that the impact of screens is perhaps not as terrible as is often claimed in the media, but fundamentally I think we're still a bit stuck because A, we are all still generally worried about screens and smartphones and social media, and B, there are some real issues there, right? There are some very real issues that we encounter when it comes to things like cyberbullying or toxic social media. Nobody's saying that these things don't exist at all. There are some real problems there. But how do we resolve this disconnect? Well, one answer could be that it's just another generational panic, right? In the same way that people worried about comic books and Dungeons and Dragons and death metal and things like that, this is just the next one in line. The flip side is that it could be the case that parental instincts are right here. There is something fundamentally wrong or bad about screens, but it's just that the science hasn't quite caught up yet. I would argue that the answer lies somewhere else. So we have this common sense view that our online lives are detached from our offline worlds, that these two versions of ourselves are very different. One's very difficult to change, our offline self, and the other is completely malleable. We can be whoever we want online. But the truth is that our online lives often mirror our offline lives, sometimes in quite complex ways, but in ways that we don't even realize. For example, parents often worry about who their kids are interacting with online, but studies have consistently shown that adolescent social networks are very similar online and offline. Basically, teenagers are using social media and messaging services by and large to manage and maintain existing social relationships as opposed to talking to random strangers. So perhaps the answer to the conundrum is, rather than framing the question as does screen time or does social media or do smartphones cause mental health problems or vice versa, we instead ask a more accurate one, which is why do some people thrive online and other people really struggle? Now, we know from a rapidly emerging area of research that not only are our online and offline worlds intrinsically connected, but that the vast majority of online threats to well-being, and particularly to adolescent well-being, find their basis in similar offline factors. So if you look at kind of bullying and cyberbullying, I'm sure we'll learn more about this today, there's a massive overlap between kids who report being bullied offline and being bullied online. Here's some data from 2018, which was a study of about 3,000 10 to 16-year-olds. And Ayman El-Assam and Adrian Katz showed here that children, basically, if you look at the specific vulnerabilities that children have, you can almost predict the online risks they will come across. So children with a physical disability or a communication difficulty, they're more likely to engage in what we call conduct risks, which is using chat rooms or online gambling sites or illegally downloading music and movies or visiting websites not intended for children to go to. Children with special educational needs are at higher risk of getting involved in unhealthy or inappropriate online relationships, so what we call contact risk. And children who've got family-related vulnerabilities tend to be at higher risk of cyber scams. So in other words, the specific types of difficulties that children and teenagers have in their offline lives goes some way to predicting what sorts of difficulties they'll encounter online. So this suggests, and there's other data to support this, that there's a much more complex and reciprocal relationship between screens, our mental health, and our behaviour. And actually a study came out literally this week that suggested this as well. So keeping on with the previous study I mentioned, if we look at the results for children with family and social vulnerabilities as an example. So we know from other research that children who are young carers generally tend to be more withdrawn and more anxious. They often feel like they're missing out on social lives with friends their own age. And it also means that they're spending a lot of their day at home, therefore potentially a lot of their day on the internet, more so than other children. So there are other challenges there. So they might be living with their own disability needs, or they might be from a lower resourced background. Kids in these sorts of situations are much less likely to have the opportunity to access meaningful education in how to stay safe online. And for various reasons, their parents might be unable to support them when it comes to using the internet. And all of those things, in turn, increase the likelihood of falling victim to identity theft or a cyber scam. So without the right sort of support systems, helping teenagers understand how to navigate online interactions in a safe and positive way, that balance between benefit and harm starts to shift in the wrong direction. So one of the biggest concerns in the research community at the minute is what we call the digital divide. So studies have shown that middle and upper class families, they have the time, the space and the resources to curate their children's online experiences and navigate that risk opportunity divide. And then there are a whole group of children living in lower resource homes who don't have that opportunity for that kind of scaffolding. They don't get to benefit in the way that they need. And it's that opens up a lot of risk. So consistent research has shown that household income levels are an important predictor of teenage mental health, but they're also a predictor of the ability to access and understand digital technology. So therefore, both directly and indirectly has the potential to impact mental health. Offline vulnerabilities can create online problems, and then they can be maintained by those online problems. And obviously, there are also direct links between offline vulnerabilities and mental health. Those things are moderated by other factors. I've mentioned socioeconomic status here, but there are lots of others which kind of moderate this relationship. So as another example here, so survey work by Common Sense Media in the US has shown that in the US, at least 73% of teenagers from lower income households have access to a computer or smartphone. In contrast, about 92% of teens from higher income households have access to a computer or smartphone. And despite that gap, on average, teens from lower income households are spending 1.5 to 2 hours more per day on screen-based media than their high income counterparts, more time on screens and social media and things like that. But of that, 50% less time using digital devices for homework each day. So what you're doing on social media, what you're doing on these devices is really important. There are a wealth of risks that can be encountered online, potentially encountered, particularly for children and adolescents. And in some cases, those risks can have an impact on well-being. Now, it's not necessarily the case that actually encountering a risky situation inevitably leads to harm. Whether it does or not depends on other factors. Pre-existing vulnerabilities can lend themselves to greater levels of problems online, which in turn can amplify or maintain those offline problems. And like I said, all of this is moderated by a range of complex other factors. So in other words, some people thrive online because they've got access to the necessary support structures around them to, in essence, shake off negative experiences when they come their way. Others really struggle because the building blocks of developing that online resilience, they were just never as readily available to them. Which category you fall into depends on a range of interacting factors, levels of inequality, time pressures, opportunities for access, many other things which you don't necessarily have any control over. So in other words, in my mind, asking questions like, does social media cause poor mental health? They're always going to be doomed to failure, those questions, because the answer is always going to be a little bit yes and a little bit no. Mental health is impacted by a variety of factors, all of which interact with each other. Screens will be part of that ecosystem, of course they will. But very recent evidence suggests that there'll be a very small part of that ecosystem. So rather than thinking of screens or social media or smartphones as the sole or the root cause of mental health problems or whatever it is that we're worried about, I think it's better to think of them as a lens through which the impact of other factors, sometimes it can be lessened, sometimes it can be intensified. And if we can start to think in that sort of way, then we can start to do better research that gives us more actionable results. I appreciate this talk doesn't really answer any of the big questions around how digital tech affects us. And the honest answer there is that given the current state of both the research literature and the public debate about screens, we can't really do that yet. But I think what we do need to do is move beyond thinking about screens in what I call a technologically deterministic sort of way. What I mean by that is this idea that we feel as though digital technologies are a fundamental driver of social and cultural structures in society. And because technology feels so powerful in that regard, we end up feeling very powerless to do anything about it. Now, I've not talked much about what big tech companies need to be doing here, and I don't want you to go away thinking that I'm an apologist for them and I think that there's nothing wrong there and they're doing fine. That is absolutely not the story. It is absolutely the case that tech companies need to be doing better in this space. I'll echo my colleague Candice Odgers on this, who said before that two things could be true at the same time. The research that we've got to date is currently not very good, and tech companies need to be doing much more immediately, much more urgently around building safety by design into these sorts of platforms. So there's a whole other chat about what those changes could be that we could have. But I'm also conscious that those sorts of things take time. And if we as individuals start to think of technology in a different way, like I say, not as the sole or the root cause of mental health, but as this sort of lens, then not only can we start to see why many of those correlational arguments that we came across earlier on, they're futile, basically, but we can begin to think about ways in which screens can be leveraged to provide better opportunities to support and improve mental health. If you're worried in the right here and now, though, about the impact that digital tech might be having on you or your children, there are some concrete things that we can do in the short term. So first and foremost, don't worry so much about the gross amount of screen time, the amount of time that you spend in front of screens. Focus on what you're doing with that time, particularly when it comes to kids. Try and create situations where you're not just putting them in front of the iPad for a few hours, but you're doing it with them. You're getting interested in the things that they're interested in. You can talk through what they find interesting, what they find not interesting or problematic about that sort of stuff. Thinking about what you're getting out of your screen-based experiences, whether you're feeling as though you're having a net positive or net negative experience, it's a really important thing to do. Being reflective, I think, is really important. Particularly when it comes to children and adolescents, we need to provide them with better support networks. So we need to be there to say, here are our boundaries and expectations around screen time, and you are the best person to decide that as a parent. Those rules will be broken because that's what teenagers do. So it's really important that we also put into place a support network for them, which is that, I want you to stick to these rules. If you break them, I want you to come and talk to me about it so we can figure out what to do next. I don't want you to hide your tech use. Hiding tech use is where things go really badly wrong, right? So part of that is modeling good behaviors around them ourselves as well. We've all developed bad habits around digital tech. Talking through it, being open and honest about what you're getting out of it and things that you feel as though you've not been happy about with your tech use in front of children could open up those conversations for them too. And if there are struggles there, remember that much of the time it might be likely that things that are going wrong for us online are echoes of problems that we might have not noticed in our offline lives. So rather than thinking about removing the tech as the first point of a solution, think about, can it lead to a conversation as a marker of something else that we need to have a conversation about? One of the big things is to reframe the way that we think about our tech use, not in terms of addictions. I've tried really hard not to use the word addiction this talk, because we use it a lot and we use it too much. Are we addicted to our screens? It's very unlikely that we are addicted to social media or smartphones. Clinically, it's not a thing. There is no formal clinical social media addiction or smartphone addiction. We use the term addiction very often when we mean we use something too much or we use something a lot and we feel like we shouldn't. Sometimes we do it when we use something a lot and we actually like that, but we feel guilty about it. But if you start talking about these things as being addictive, you get stuck in not having many solutions to that. The solution is abstinence or detox, removing the thing. And we know from lots of research that those sorts of things tend not to work. Are you addicted to your phone? It's very unlikely. Have you developed bad habits with your phone? Definitely yes. Everybody has. I have. You've also developed some good habits as well. Habits are neutral in and of themselves. Whether a habit creates a good or a bad outcome depends on a number of situational factors, of which self-regulation is a really important one. And we all struggle with this, right? But I think we could all certainly benefit from being more reflective about our own time on screens and what we're doing on our phones and tablets. So if you're really struggling in the here and now, one of the simplest things you can do first is just try to be a bit more aware of what you're doing on your phone and what you're doing in front of your kids and things like that. And at the point where you go, okay, it's 11 o'clock at night and I wanted to go to bed an hour ago, but here I am still on Instagram. Trying to have a think about why that happened over the past hour. Did you get something good out of it? If so, is it a problem? If you didn't get something good about it, what can you do for yourself next time, tomorrow night, when you're in that situation, to just maybe change things a little bit? So we're not talking about big drastic changes all in one go, but little shifts here and there, just so that we're making these things, these technologies, which are tools for us, then we're making them work for us rather than us being beholden to them. phones are not destroying a generation, right? Whether we like it or not, they're an integral part of it. So if you take anything else away from this talk, it's just that, the next time you see these doom-laden headlines around screens destroying society, don't just kind of blindly agree or disagree with it, but and certainly don't fall into despair. Instead, think about, well, what's the evidence going to be for that claim? We know that the research picture is mixed here. So is there one big study that suddenly changed everything? Probably not. But more importantly, does it present an opportunity for you to think about how you can best make screens work for you in your own life? And remember, you have the power to do that. So I'll pause there because I think I'm a little bit over time, but I hope that was useful. Thank you very much for listening. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. It's always very difficult when you're online because now we're going to be very rude and just cut you off. But
that's fine. That's okay.
But listen, I think that gave everybody a huge amount to think about and starts us off on a conversation we're going to have now and follow on with Megan from DCU. So thanks very much. Thank you.
Good stuff. Thank you. Enjoy the rest of the day, everybody. And yeah, I'm sorry I can't say it. Megan's brilliant. So it'll be an amazing talk next. So enjoy. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.